Kevin Byrne, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I do appreciate it.
Now tell us about Enterprise North, its aims and the region and the centres that you represent.
Look, Enterprise North has been alive for about 3.5 years now. We were formed by a bunch of people who had similar aspirations and views about what we should do in advocating for policy and infrastructure for Northern Australia, and particularly Northern Queensland, Far North Queensland in our particular case, to grow Australia. Now, there is still going a fair degree of frustration about not matching the rhetoric with deed when it comes to populating Northern Australia and taking advantage of Northern Australia. We've had pretty well bipartisan support over the years about what should happen in Northern Australia and the need to grow Northern Australia. Really, at the end of the day, precious little has happened. I first started going to conferences about developing Northern Australia when I left the Army in 1987 and was running the Office of Northern and Regional Development in Cairns. And if you have a look at the agenda today, with these Northern Australia Development Conferences, that agenda really has changed little in the past 30 years. Our population growth is declining as people become more urbanised. So there's a real challenge ahead, and that's why we formed. And we are an organisation that is wedded to honest and robust advocacy for policy changes and the right policy mix to grow our populations in Northern Australia. And indeed, part of that is the infrastructure required to support the communities that will grow as population comes to the north. So that's probably it in a nutshell. We're wholly owned by our members. We're an incorporated organisation, and we attempt to play a positive role in bringing people to migrate to our part of the world, live here and sustain growth into the future. And I have no doubt that'll happen, but we want it to be accelerated.
One of the nice things about North Queensland, Cairns, Port Douglas and all that area, maybe it's because you're so far away, but North Queensland, Cairns, Port Douglas, has this wonderful community spirit, doesn't it?
Yes, we do. Many of our communities sustained on that, particularly when we go through hardship periods. And we're doing that now, I've got to tell you. So, yes, that's a wonderful foundation for us. And we need to be very careful and jealously guard that. What happens in our Australia, I guess, but certainly our part of the world, as we become more remote and governments are more urban-centric because they've got the population numbers and therefore the power in the democracy, the way we exist, many of our towns, certainly I've seen a shift in Cairns, we become corporatised rather than the way we commence, and that is in Cairns' case in particular, as opposed to Townsville. We were born from an entrepreneurial spirit, and Cairns and Port Douglas still largely has that entrepreneurial spirit, and we need to guard it jealously because more and more we're being sucked into this vortex of Queensland first, and you need to be part of the Queensland narrative and Team Queensland. Really, that's code for, from a political point of view, across all political parties, is a Brisbane-centric message that we will operate the state of Queensland out of what happens in the southeast corner and the policies that drive SEQ. And we've seen that certainly in this pandemic year play out to a great degree of detriment to regions across Northern Australia.
What's the impact of government COVID policies and border closures on local business, the economic and communities in general?
Look, it's been frankly disastrous. From the initial lockdown in March all the way through, and I can understand the general feeling and fear in communities. But we've been hoodwinked to a great degree, and we have told everybody that we have the best medical facilities in the world, we've got the best medical systems in the world and so on, and yet we haven't trusted them 1 inch. We've had politicians across Australia saying to everybody that their first responsibility is to keep everybody safe. Well, it's not really. Their first responsibility is wider than that. Safety of citizens is paramount, we accept that. But also there is a responsibility to keep this community sustained and the community economic activities safe from interruption also. So it's a dual responsibility that I say that across Australia, premiers and chief ministers and so on have not adhered to. They have really taken hold of this fear syndrome in Australia and responded accordingly. At the start of this pandemic, there was a great deal of optimism about the role of National Cabinet. And the National Cabinet's health advice and the way they were directing policy was a containment strategy across Australia and identifying those areas where COVID was appearing and dealing with it. We had a very strong and robust medical system, and we still have. But instead of that being the ethos from a national perspective, it became each state, with the notable exception of New South Wales, it became an elimination strategy. And when you have an elimination strategy, the initial response is to maximise your political gain out of that. And in the case of Queensland, for example, we were lumped into that strategy. So, for example, Cairns, a community in Far North Queensland, a community 2,200 kilometres of Brisbane, from Brisbane, further from Brisbane than incidentally Melbourne is from Brisbane, we were lumped into a false strategy that has played out in an enormously economic disruptive way with this community. We've advocated open borders, and we continue to advocate open borders domestically in Australia. And the Australian government is operating a quarantine border situation internationally, and we understand the reasons for that. But a cross-border trade, cross-border visitation needs to go ahead to the fullest extent possible, and that does not include ambit opening and closing of borders.
Do you think governments really appreciate what's on the line here? And part two of this, do you think the locals really understand? Because at the moment, which is going to come to an end, a lot of businesses in tourism are being helped out by government with JobKeeper, and that's going to go in a couple of weeks' time. So on one hand, we have the government, even though they have given out almost $1 billion to help tourism around Australia. But do you think they really understand what's on the line? And do you think the locals really understand what could very well happen if the support isn't there and that the borders aren't kept open?
That's a good question. The short answer is no, I don't believe they have. The realisation of many of the decisions are coming home now with stark reality. You can't, it's disingenuous, for example, in Queensland, for our Premier to run the line that, you need to keep JobKeeper going indefinitely to keep communities active and safe, when much of the reason she's making this demand was caused by the state government actions in the first instance. And we've seen that in other parts of Australia. So in terms of honesty, there's a big question mark there. In terms of political nuancing and political advantage, of course you'd say that, because much of what we're going through now, and communities are fearing this, is that there's going to be a contest between states and the federal government and the national good, I might say, in how we manage to get to phase two of this. Phase one was basically locking everybody down and frightening the living daylights out of them. And you run policy around that. But at the end of the day, this thing will come to an end, and it will come to an end pretty smartly with the rollout of vaccines. And then you're faced with, how do we pick these economies up? How do we come back to employing people? How do we come back to growth in our population? How do we grow the confidence of our citizens that this thing is under control? How do we harmonise the relationships between state members of parliament, federal members of parliament and local government leaders? And what is the best outcome for our communities? You know, we need to have parents and communities know that these schools are going to remain open and kids will be able to go to school and learn and associate it with each other. Everybody's thinking that, you know, we're going to snap back to normality overnight. We're not. We need to get back to normality, which will be different in the quickest possible time. And that means that the state governments need to look rigidly at the economic fallout of much of what's transpired in the past year.
I think one of the terrible words right now that's been bandied around by governments, especially in the Western pseudo-democracies, that's emergency. In Victoria, Dan Andrews is, besides falling downstairs after a few drinks, and that's only hearsay, by the way, has these emergency powers for another 9 months. They all want this emergency power, and part two of that is that the vaccine, they're saying, oh, you can still get COVID, get the coronavirus, and therefore lockdowns, you know, are still going to be on the go. It's the whole thing seems to be more of a as you mentioned, a political standpoint. You know, they can, you know, get some votes and look good because they've saved a life, but also has a lot of control to it. And, you know, sure, it might be okay. They may get away with it in a city that has, you know, 3, 4, 5 million people there for a couple of days because they're all enclosed. But when you're up north, you know, you're a long way away. 2 hours by flight from Brizzy, or 2 hours and 10 minutes. And 3 or 2.5 days to drive if you're going to be sensible, you're a long way away. So those decisions here don't really, you know, gel a whole lot with what's happening out of those metropolitan areas, does it?
You're absolutely correct. And this has been our discussion all along. You know, I'm sitting here representing Enterprise North, and I've just spoken to you about it and what we do, the important work that we do. On a day-to-day basis, we're confronted with this absurd situation, I would classify it as, and it's my personal private position, it's not my members' position because I haven't tested it, but where state governments have ceded powers to unelected bureaucrats. Now, in the case of Queensland, for example, the Premier says, listen, it's not my decision or my position here, but I'm responding to the health advice, and the health advice is this. I mean, it's all very easy to deflect that. And similarly, in Victoria, the same situation prevailed. We live in a democracy. The health bureaucrats, police bureaucrats, or whatever, it's incumbent upon them, in my view, to give advice to government. And government, elected people, make the decisions. Because the fact is that government representatives need to have a whole approach to what responsibilities are. And part of the health response is for, you know, for example, a classic is for as much full employment as possible, as much government support as possible for those who fall by the wayside. I mean, that's part of a health response in my view. And, you know, we classify ourselves as having responded magnificently to this COVID pandemic. And if you have a look at the raw numbers, with the exception of one particular state, that is true. But the other issues are going to come back and need attention. And nobody's looking at those. And I talk about the social issues of long-term unemployment. I refer to the social issues of the haves and the have-nots. Now, these people are part of the communities that you and I spoke about before, Port Douglas and Cairns and regional communities across this state and this great nation more broadly. And I think that there should be more emphasis placed on how those communities are going to manage their way out of this also. My private position is JobKeeper had to stop. We couldn't go on as a country incurring the massive rollout of debts. And this argument that JobKeeper needs to go on for as long as international borders are effectively closed to international visitors can't be sustained morally. And, whilst we might feel awfully sorry for those people who will be victims of this, our responsibilities will be to pick those people up and carry on in a different way. This is a great opportunity for places like Cairns and Port Douglas and further west in our western geographic areas, Darwin in Northern Australia, the Kimberleys and so on, of discovering new ways of how we can survive independently but linked to our state governments and the federal government. But we need a lot of localised decision making here and some serious contemplation about how we're going to come out of this. And we hope as Enterprise North to play some sort of role in that. We've got all the tools here. The federal government has provided RDAs, that's regional development organisations across Northern Australia and in regional Australia. Up here we've got a Northern Australian Infrastructure Fund. We've got governments pushing money out the door to keep people employed. We need to coordinate all this effort to, at the same time, growing our communities rather than sustaining a social service mentality. We need to cut the umbilical cord, for want of a better term, and power on. We've got an opportunity now to re-engineer our tourism offerings in Cairns and Port Douglas, and I dare say across Northern Australia. And we need to be actively pursuing those. So I don't want to say too much because I could talk about this for half a day, but I want to focus on what needs to be done. And that's what we're doing. And I hope that and I thank you for the opportunity, but I hope there are people listening to what we are saying.
We could talk all day and I would like to, but we haven't got all that long. A very serious issue though. Look, compliance by fear has consequences. Until we can travel, until we can get over the fear of travel, what do you think we can expect in growth and getting back to not COVID normal, but to normal, maybe in the next 12, 18 months? What do we have to do?
Well, we've got to conquer the fear. That's the reality. Now, let's just go back to AstraZeneca. We have in Australia a health system or health people, Murphy, Kelly, Professor Murphy and Professor Kelly nationally and others. We've got some smart brains at the state level also. Their advice to the Australian public is pretty consistent. The advice from every known person whom I respect about the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine is fine. And I think that our communities are not served by people who are disputing that because of what might occur in the European Union and what might occur because of some professor in Stockholm in Sweden calling it out. I would rather rely on the efficacy of the Australian medical fraternity. I love our medical processes in Australia, and I think we're world leaders.
Kevin, great to talk to you. If somebody wants to find out more, though, about Enterprise North, how do they do that?
Well, you can go on the website, that's the easiest way. Go on the website or send me an email. It's up there, exec@enterprisenorth.org.au, and all the contact details are there. I'm very proud of what we do. I'm very, very proud of this part of the world. Can I just finish on a couple of statistics? I mean, we get 2019, we were the recipient, thankfully, of 3.4 million visitors. That generates a hell of a lot of money and a hell of a lot of employment. And of that, 3.4 million, that's visitation across every sector. But there are 800,000 international visitors that either came through Cairns Airport direct or through from southern ports as part of tour packages. And, our international visitation has come to a grinding halt. So that is something we need to work on. And we look forward, and we've got a wonderful product here. The Great Barrier Reef's in tip-top shape. We've got people that want to take you out there. We've got great guides. We've got great professionalism. So we're looking forward to welcoming all those people back into the tourism economy, and we also look forward to future investment in the broader economy of Far North Queensland. So thank you for the opportunity of talking to you.
Kevin, thank you very much.